Have you ever made one decision in anger and spent the next 18 years paying for it? Because Charlotte Vale did. At 16, she ran away from one of the richest families in Savannah after a vicious fight with her mother. Before sunrise, her world had collapsed. Before the next spring, she was holding a baby in her arms. And before she ever had the chance to find the one man who might have changed everything, he was gone. What Charlotte didn't know was that the night she lost her way, she had also found the love that would haunt the rest of her life. And what he didn't know was that somewhere, in a city he had long since left behind, a boy was growing up with his eyes. This is the story of a runaway heiress, a truck driver who disappeared, a son born into silence, and the kind of reunion that only comes after almost 2 decades of grief, bad timing, and unanswered questions. And trust me, the ending was not the part that hurt the most. Charlotte Vale was born into the kind of wealth people romanticize from a distance and suffocate under up close. Her father, Victor Vale, wasn't just rich. He was the kind of rich that made judges return calls and made newspaper editors think twice before printing the wrong thing. Hotels, freight contracts, old property, investment firms, his money did not sparkle, it moved. Quietly, efficiently, like power always does. Her mother, Eleanor, came from old Southern money and carried herself like every room belonged to her before she entered it. She was beautiful in a way that made people lower their voices. Controlled, elegant, impossible to read unless you were her daughter. And Charlotte? Charlotte was the part of the family portrait that never stayed still. She was too sharp, too restless, too emotional, too alive for the world her parents had prepared for her. At school, teachers called her bright but difficult. At home, staff called her Miss Charlotte, with the careful tone people used around lit matches. In society pages, she was the rebellious daughter with expensive taste and no gratitude. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked what it does to a girl to grow up in a mansion where every door is open and somehow nothing feels like freedom. Charlotte had every material thing a teenager could want, and almost none of the tenderness. Her mother corrected more than she comforted. Her father provided more than he listened. Love in the Vale household was often delivered as expectation, protection as control, concern as humiliation. Charlotte learned early that being the only child in a powerful house did not make her cherished. It made her watched, and the night everything changed began with a curfew. That was the ridiculous part. Not betrayal, not disaster, not some dramatic family secret. Curfew. Charlotte came home later than she was supposed to on a hot, storm-heavy evening, with thunder murmuring somewhere far off and that stubborn teenage confidence still carrying her through the front door. She expected anger, maybe a lecture, maybe a week of being monitored. She did not expect the argument that followed to split her life in half. Eleanor was waiting in the drawing room, sitting in a pool of lamplight with a glass of untouched iced tea at her elbow. "Where were you?" she asked. Charlotte dropped her purse on a chair. "Out." It was the wrong answer, and both of them knew it. "Don't speak to me like that," Eleanor said. "Then don't ask questions you've already answered for yourself." By the time Victor lowered his newspaper, the room was already ruined. "You will stop humiliating this family," Eleanor snapped. Charlotte laughed bitterly. "That's what this is about? Always? The family?" Victor folded the paper and stood. "Enough." But Charlotte was beyond enough. "No," she said, her voice trembling now with the kind of anger that comes from years, not moments. "You don't get to tell me enough. Neither of you do. You don't want a daughter. You want a project. Something you can shape and display and hand off to the right kind of future." Eleanor rose slowly. "Everything you have comes from this family." Charlotte took a step forward. "Then maybe that's why I can't breathe in it." The room went still. Victor's face hardened. And then Eleanor said the sentence Charlotte would hear in her head for years afterward. "You are a child," she said coldly. "You know nothing about real pain." If Charlotte had been older, maybe she would have heard the fear beneath those words. But she was 16, wounded and furious and desperate to matter, and all she heard was this: "What hurts you doesn't count." So she walked out, past her father's voice, past her mother calling her name, past the open front doors and the white columns and the line of manicured hedges. She walked straight out of her family's house and into the kind of night that changes people. At first, it felt glorious. That's what nobody tells you about bad decisions made in anger. At the beginning, they can feel exactly like freedom. Charlotte walked fast, breathing hard, her heart pounding with adrenaline and pride. For the first hour, she wasn't scared. She was almost laughing. She was finally outside the reach of her parents' rules, their schedules, their plans for her life. The city felt big and alive and anonymous in a way she had never been allowed to experience. But anger burns fast, and night lasts longer than pride thinks it will. By midnight, her phone battery was dying. By 1, it was dead. By then, she was far from the historic part of Savannah people photographed for postcards. The streets had changed without her noticing. Fewer lights, more broken windows, empty lots, chain-link fences, storefronts with iron gates pulled down. She kept telling herself she'd find a gas station, a busier road, someplace to think. Instead, she found an overpass lined with tents and shopping carts, and men who noticed her immediately. One whistled. Another laughed and said, "Well, you look expensive." Charlotte kept walking. When she heard footsteps behind her, her stomach dropped. She turned into an alley because it was the nearest opening, hoping it would lead somewhere brighter, somewhere safer. Didn't. Wet brick. Dumpsters. No one around. A hand caught her wrist. She jerked back hard, but by then there were 3 of them. One in front, one to the side, one behind. Whatever they had wanted at first, it wasn't just teasing anymore. Charlotte said, "Please let go of me," and hated how frightened she sounded. One of them smiled. That smile terrified her more than shouting would have. She shoved him and tried to run, but someone caught the back of her shirt and slammed her hard against the wall. Pain flashed through her shoulder. Panic took over completely. There are moments in life when your body understands danger before your mind can catch up, and this was one of them. Then came the headlights. A blast of horns split the alley open. A massive truck barreled into the entrance and stopped at a vicious angle, bright lights flooding the brick in white. The driver's door flew open. A man jumped down so fast it felt like the night itself had changed sides. Tall, broad-shouldered, denim shirt, work boots, rough hands. He looked at the scene once and knew enough. Back away from her. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He said it like a man who expected to be obeyed. One of them cursed. Another took a step toward him. That was a mistake. What followed happened so fast Charlotte barely processed it later. Boots on gravel, a fist, one man stumbling into a dumpster, another retreating, curses thrown into the dark. Then the rapid collapse of cheap courage when men realized they no longer control the situation. And then, just like that, they were gone. The stranger turned to her. "Are you hurt?" Charlotte couldn't answer. She was shaking so hard her teeth nearly clicked. He didn't come closer right away. Didn't reach for her. Didn't ask who she was or what she had been doing there. He just waited until her breathing calmed enough for words to exist again. "My name's Luke," he said. "You shouldn't stay here." She looked up at him through panic and rain. There was a cut across his knuckles and rainwater in his dark hair. He looked tired in a permanent way. Road tired. Life tired. But his eyes were steady and kind. And in that moment that was enough to feel almost miraculous. "I don't know where to go," she whispered. He nodded once. "Then sit in the truck until you figure it out." That was all. No pressure. No charm. No invitation disguised as rescue. Just a simple offer of safety. Inside the truck, the world shrank into leather seats, dashboard lights, the smell of coffee and motor oil, and the low hum of a country station on the radio. Luke handed her an old flannel shirt from the back seat without looking at her while she pulled it over her clothes. That one gesture, him turning away to give her privacy, did something to Charlotte she wouldn't fully understand until much later. Because for a girl raised around men who admired control, this stranger's restraint felt like grace. He drove her to an all-night diner off the highway. There, under fluorescent lights and with coffee going cold between them, they began to talk. Not all at once. Not dramatically. just in pieces. She said she'd fought with her parents, that she'd walked too far, that she hadn't known where she was going. He said he drove freight, that he was 34, that he'd been on the road so long it felt stranger to sleep in a house than in a cab, that he had once been married and learned the hard way that not everyone is built for a life spent leaving. She didn't tell him her last name. He didn't ask. He told her he liked storms better when he wasn't driving through them. She told him she hated being told what kind of life she was supposed to want. He asked if she always sounded that angry. She asked if he always sounded that tired. He laughed. That was the first moment she saw how warm his face became when he forgot to guard it. By dawn, something had happened between them. Not a romance exactly, not yet, but a recognition that felt almost more dangerous. Two lonely people, from opposite worlds, meeting in the narrow place between fear and mourning. When they left the diner, the rain had become soft and steady. Luke found her a cheap motel run by an older couple who clearly knew better than to ask questions of travelers with haunted eyes. He paid for the room before she could stop him. "I'll pay you back," Charlotte said automatically. He looked at her with the faintest hint of a smile. "Sure." He wrote a number on the back of a receipt. "Truck stop pay phone," he said. "Some Tuesdays." Charlotte took it. She should have just thanked him. She should have let the night become what such nights usually become. Intense, strange, unforgettable, and over. But people who have gone too long without gentleness are dangerous around kindness. At the motel door, neither of them seemed able to walk away. Luke touched her face once, like he was asking a question without words. What passed between them in those hours before morning fully arrived stayed with Charlotte for the next 18 years. Not because it was wild or reckless, but because it was the first time in her life she had felt held without being managed. No promises were made. No forever spoken. Just comfort, warmth, a pause in the cruelty of the world. And then, because real life is often crueler than fiction, they parted. Luke left after sunrise. Charlotte watched the truck disappear. And by the time the next spring came, everything had changed. Her family found her a week later. Victor had used money and pressure to keep the incident quiet. Eleanor had told everyone Charlotte was resting. The staff had been warned. The city had moved on. Inside the Vale estate, however, there was no moving on. The moment Charlotte returned, the house swallowed her. She was watched, managed, handled. No one asked what she felt. No one asked what she needed. Then she found out she was pregnant. The news detonated through the family like scandal soaked in gasoline. Victor demanded a name. Eleanor demanded a solution. Doctors were whispered about. Boarding schools were mentioned. Then suddenly not mentioned. Lawyers appeared in the hallways like shadows in suits. Charlotte refused every plan they tried to make for her. And she refused to give them Luke. Not because she didn't trust him. Because she didn't trust them. She tried to find him in secret. The number stopped working. The truck stop had changed hands. She knew only his first name and the route he might once have driven. Meanwhile, Luke was gone for reasons she wouldn't learn until much later. The freight company he had been driving for folded in the middle of an embezzlement investigation. Drivers were laid off with almost no warning. Luke left Georgia within months, first for Arkansas, then Oklahoma, then Texas. New routes, new companies, new pay numbers. The road, once his livelihood, became the thing that erased him. Charlotte gave birth at 17. Her labor lasted all night. Victor never came upstairs. Eleanor stood outside the room for an hour and then left. Only one older nurse stayed with Charlotte the entire time and whispered, "Breathe, honey," as if that was the only instruction in the world that mattered. When the baby finally arrived and was laid in Charlotte's trembling arms, he opened his eyes almost immediately. Dark eyes, quiet eyes, steady eyes. She named him Henry, and in that moment, without warning, the spoiled, reckless, furious girl everyone thought they knew disappeared. In her place stood a mother. That did not make life easier. It made it sharper, because now Charlotte had something to lose. The next 18 years came like waves. At first, they were made of sleeplessness, milk-stained dresses, whispers in hallways, and the humiliating experience of learning to parent while being treated like a scandal under her own roof. Victor rarely acknowledged Henry by name. Eleanor acted as though affection might make things worse, though every so often Charlotte would catch her standing in the nursery doorway longer than necessary. Charlotte finished her education through tutors and special arrangements while rocking Henry to sleep between lessons. At 19, she discovered photography. Not polished portraiture. Not the kind of art rich families hung over fireplaces to prove they had taste. The real kind. Street corners in rain. Bus stops at dusk. A tired waitress with blistered feet and perfect eyeliner. Henry asleep with one fist curled beneath his cheek. The city beyond the gated neighborhoods. Photography gave Charlotte a way to see suffering without flinching from it. And maybe more importantly, it gave her a way to tell the truth in a world built on concealment. At 21, she began quietly using trust money to support shelters and outreach programs in the very neighborhoods she had once been taught to fear. She never told her father. She didn't need his approval to know what hunger looked like anymore. At 22, Henry asked where his father was. Charlotte sat with him on the back steps, watching heat rise from the garden stones, and said, "I don't know. Did he leave us?" The question broke something tender inside her. "No," she said carefully. "We lost each other." Henry thought about that, then said, "Maybe he's looking too." That thought kept Charlotte alive on certain nights. At 24, she followed a lead to Tennessee after hearing about a driver named Luke with a scar across his hand. Wrong man. At 26, she received an unsigned note saying someone matching Luke's description was working at a repair yard outside Tulsa. She flew there herself. Wrong man again. At 27, Henry got into a school fight after another boy called him a mistake. At 28, Charlotte held her first photography show under her own first name only, no veil attached. Critics called her work unsentimental and devastating. Victor refused to attend. Eleanor came secretly and cried in front of a photograph titled Roadside Dawn. At 29, Henry nearly drowned in a summer storm after slipping from a dock. Charlotte jumped in after him without thinking and dragged him out herself. That night, sitting beside his bed while he slept, she realized fear had changed shape in her life. She no longer feared for herself, only for him. 31, Victor suffered a stroke. He lived, but not with dignity. His speech slurred. His temper worsened. He needed help, and Charlotte gave it because mercy is not always reserved for the deserving. One evening, Victor watched Henry repair an old clock mechanism on the library floor and muttered with difficulty, "Good hands." It was the closest thing to tenderness Charlotte had ever heard from him. He died that winter. At the funeral, the city praised his discipline, intelligence, and legacy. Charlotte stood in black beside Henry and thought only this: he did not know how to love gently. Eleanor began fading after that. Her illness was slow and humiliating, the kind that stripped away vanity one small surrender at a time. Charlotte cared for her through it all. There, in those long late-night hours of medication and silence, mother and daughter finally spoke honestly. One night Eleanor whispered, "I thought if I controlled your life, I could protect you from pain." Charlotte sat very still. Eleanor turned her face toward the window where rain was tapping softly against the glass. "Instead, I became part of it." It was not enough to undo the past. It was enough to make Charlotte weep after she left the room. When Eleanor died, Charlotte inherited nearly everything. Money, property, businesses, land. The newspapers called her one of the most eligible and powerful women in Georgia. The title meant nothing. By then Henry was 18, tall and thoughtful and gifted with the same mechanical instinct Luke had once carried in his hands. Charlotte had spent 18 years searching for a man she only knew in fragments, and somehow her son had grown into him anyway. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. Not a dramatic day, not a storm, not an anniversary. Just an ordinary gray afternoon when Charlotte's car started making a terrible grinding sound near the industrial side of town. She nearly called roadside assistance, but a small garage appeared on the corner first.
Beaker Auto and Diesel.
She pulled in. Inside, the garage smelled like hot metal, rubber, and grease. A radio played low from somewhere in the back. One of the younger mechanics glanced up and shouted, "Luke, customer." Charlotte went cold. No, no way. A man rolled out from under a pickup truck on a mechanic's creeper and stood. Older, broader, gray at the temples. But him, absolutely him. For one impossible second, they simply stared at each other. Then Luke said her name. Charlotte? The rag slipped from his hand. The younger mechanic looked between them. Boss? Luke didn't look away. Take lunch. When the others left, the silence in that garage felt almost holy. Charlotte had imagined that reunion 1,000 times. In most versions, she was calm. Instead, she heard herself say, "I looked for you." Luke sat down hard on a stool as though his legs had betrayed him. "You did?" "For 18 years. His hand rose to his mouth. His eyes were already wet. Then Charlotte said the sentence that broke open what was left of his composure. "You have a son." The air changed. "A son?" he whispered. "He's 18. Luke stared at her like the world had just told him his whole life belonged to a story he'd never been allowed to read. "I didn't know," he said. "I know. I swear to God, Charlotte, I didn't know. I know." He turned away, paced once, came back, sat again, stood again. He looked wrecked. "What's his name?" "Henry." Luke laughed once, but it shattered on the way out. "Henry." Then came the hardest question. "Does he hate me?" Charlotte's throat tightened. "No," she said. "He doesn't know you enough to." Henry met him 3 days later in the garage office. No speeches. No dramatic music. Just silence and resemblance. Henry had Charlotte's mouth, Luke's eyes, and a kind of careful stillness that made him seem older than 18. "You're Luke," Henry said. "Yeah."
I'm Henry.
"I know." Then Henry asked, direct and unsparing, "If you had known about me, would you have come?" Luke didn't even hesitate. "I would have crossed every state in this country." Henry studied him a long moment, then nodded once. That wasn't forgiveness, but it was hope. And then, because life never seems content with one blow at a time, 2 weeks later Henry was in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. Charlotte got the call after 11 at night. Luke drove her to the hospital because she was shaking too badly to drive. In the waiting room, under harsh fluorescent lights, they sat through the kind of hours that stretch human beings thin. Luke got her coffee she couldn't drink, held her upright when panic made the room tilt, said very little but stayed. Henry survived. Broken ribs, concussion, collarbone. He survived. And after that night, Luke stopped feeling like a stranger who had returned. He started feeling like family that had come home too late, but home anyway. Recovery brought them closer than reunion had. Luke came by every day. He cooked badly, fixed things nobody asked him to fix, argued with Henry about engines, stood in Charlotte's kitchen like he had been missing from it all along. One evening, Charlotte found him in her studio looking at a framed photograph of an empty highway washed in rain. "I took that the morning after I met you," she said. Luke turned slowly. "You kept it? For 18 years. He looked at her with a kind of grief that only comes from realizing you were loved in your absence. "All this time," he said quietly, "I thought maybe I'd imagined what we were." Charlotte smiled, though tears were already in her eyes. "I spent 18 years proving to myself I hadn't." When he kissed her then, it wasn't the electricity of youth. It was something sadder, deeper, more earned, like time finally admitting it had been cruel. They married the following spring under an old oak tree on the estate grounds. Henry stood beside Luke. A few close friends came. The garage crew came in uncomfortable formal shoes. There were no society pages, no performance, no polished spectacle. Just vows, truth, relief. Later, Charlotte transferred much of her inheritance into trusts, charities, and Henry's future. She offered Luke half of what remained. He refused twice. Then she said, "Nothing in my life was ever ours. I want this to be," and he stopped refusing. Luke expanded the garage with Henry. Charlotte kept photographing ordinary lives with extraordinary tenderness. The mansion slowly became a home instead of a monument. Years later, on rainy evenings, they would sit together on the porch and listen to weather move through the trees. Sometimes Luke would look at her and say, "Funny how a broken car had to finish what fate started." And Charlotte would lean against his shoulder and answer, "No, fate only made us meet. Love was the part that waited." Because that was the truth. The world did not give them innocence. It did not give them easy timing. It did not give them back the 18 years they lost. It gave them silence, distance, regret. A son raised between absence and love. Parents who apologized too late. 1,000 chances to stop believing. And then, one ordinary afternoon, it gave them a garage. Sometimes that's how grace arrives. Not with thunder. Not with miracles. Not with perfect timing. Just a grinding sound beneath the hood. A faded sign over a service bay. And the one face you never stopped carrying finally turning toward you in the light.